People think they know what weed is. Weed is a plant, weed is a medicine, weed is a felony, and weed is a billion-dollar industry. But before all that, it's a high, a shift in how your brain processes reality. A chemical conversation you didn't know you were having. A sensation that's been chased and celebrated and criminalized for centuries. So in this video, we're gonna start there. What actually happens when you get high? To understand what it actually means to get high, you have to start with the fact that your body was already wired for it long before cannabis ever entered the picture. Every one of us has what's called the endocannabinoid system, or ECS. It's not some fringe discovery either. It's a whole network of receptors, neurotransmitters, and enzymes that quietly regulates everyday life. Think of it like background software, always running, tuning things like mood, appetite, memory, pain, and sleep. The body produces its own cannabinoids, compounds like anandamide, sometimes called the bliss molecule, and 2-AG, that they slot into those receptors naturally. And when their job is done, enzymes swoop in to break them down, keeping the system balanced. The whole point of ECS is homeostasis, a constant back and forth tug to keep your body stable even while the world around you changes. Cannabis takes that already working system and hijacks it. The psychoactive compound, THC, fits into those CB1 receptors that are scattered all over your brain and nervous system. It doesn't act perfectly, scientists call it a partial agonist, but it's strong enough to shift the way that those receptors fire. It's why the effects are so wide-ranging. You're not just flipping one switch, you're dimming and brightening entire networks at once. CBD, on the other hand, behaves differently. It doesn't lock into CB1 the way THC does, and for years it was even called inactive because scientists couldn't pin down a single receptor it worked on. Instead, CBD seems to be more of a modulator, nudging serotonin, vanilloid, and adenosine systems, or altering the way THC interacts with CB1. That's why some people say CBD smooths out a high. Beyond those two, there are dozens of minor cannabinoids. CBG, often nicknamed the mother cannabinoid because it's the chemical precursor to many others. CBN, which forms as THC breaks down and may contribute to sedative effects. And THCV, a rarer molecule that at low doses can even blunt appetite instead of increasing it. Each one is a slightly different key in the same lock, producing effects we're only starting to map. How you consume cannabis changes the entire experience. Inhalation, whether smoking or vaping, sends THC into the bloodstream through the lungs almost immediately. You feel it within minutes because the molecules bypass digestion and head straight for the brain. Edibles take a detour. When THC passes through the liver, it's metabolized into a different compound called 11-hydroxy-THC, which crosses into the brain even more easily and tends to feel stronger, longer lasting, and sometimes more disorienting. That's why the classic edible story is like someone takes too much, they don't feel anything at first, and then they get overwhelmed an hour later. Sublingual products, like tinctures under the tongue, aim to split the difference, using the membranes in your mouth for quicker absorption without the weight of digestion. However it enters, though, THC eventually breaks down, and that determines the duration. A smoked joint might fade after 2 hours, while a brownie can stretch the ride to 6 or more. The subjective effects are what people chase, and they're also what make cannabis so hard to pin down scientifically. Time can feel like it's stretching, sound and color become richer, and many users describe a sense of novelty. Mundane things like music or food take on a new intensity. That's the euphoric ride. But the same chemical conversation can also tip in the other direction. Heightened awareness of your own body and thoughts can spiral into paranoia, racing heartbeats, or even panic. Short-term memory disruptions are common. Conversations lose their thread. Tasks slip away mid-thought. And not everyone's experience looks alike because it depends on so many variables. Your personal biology, your history of use, the specific mix of cannabinoids and terpenes in the product, and even your mental state going in. For some, cannabis feels like a creative spark or a calming balm. For others, it's confusion and discomfort. At the core, the high isn't just one sensation. It's a network effect with dozens of receptors, compounds, and feedback loops all firing at once. That's what makes cannabis both fascinating and unpredictable. The same plant that relaxes one person can unravel another, all because of the hidden wiring inside their endocannabinoid system. When people talk about cannabis, the conversation usually starts with labels like sativa and indica. For decades, those two words have been shorthand for effect. Sativa means uplifting, indica means sedating. But the truth is, that's more folklore than science. Botanically, which is the science word for of the study of plants, cannabis does have different subspecies: sativa, indica, and ruderalis. But the distinctions come from how they grow, not how they make you feel. Sativas were tall, airy plants adapted to equatorial regions with long growing seasons. Indicas were shorter, bushier plants from harsher climates like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And ruderalis, which I never even heard of before researching this video, was a scrappy, fast-flowering variety from Central and Eastern Europe. But in the modern era, nearly every commercial strain is a hybrid, a genetic mix that blurs those old categories. That's why researchers prefer the term chemovar now, meaning chemical variety. Instead of assuming effect based on leaf shape or plant height, you actually look at the chemical fingerprint, which cannabinoids are dominant, which terpenes are present, and in what ratios. That's what truly determines the character of a given plant. At the microscopic level, the action happens in the trichomes. Those tiny crystal-like hairs that make buds look frosty are actually factories. Inside, the plant produces cannabinoids like THC and CBD, along with the aromatic terpenes that give each variety its scent. Trichomes evolved as a kind of protection, sticky resin to deter herbivores, UV shielding to keep the plant safe, pungent aromas to repel pests. But for humans, they're the most valuable part. When you grind up cannabis flower, it's the trichomes you're really after because that's where the psychoactive and therapeutic chemistry lives. Among the cannabinoids, THC and CBD are the headliners. THC is the one that produces intoxication, while CBD has exploded in popularity as a non-intoxicating counterpart with a very different pharmacology. But the picture widens when you factor in terpenes. Mycrene, with its earthy, musky scent, is one of the most common and often associated with relaxation. Limonene, citrusy and sharp, is linked anecdotally with elevated mood. Pinene, which smells like a pine forest, very creative name, may counteract some of THC's memory effects. Linalool, familiar from lavender, is tied to calming properties. This mix of cannabinoids and terpenes interacting together is sometimes called the entourage effect. The idea that cannabis works best not as isolated compounds, but as a symphony where each molecule modulates the others. There's some evidence for this, particularly with CBD altering THC's impact, but in many cases, the entourage effect remains more theory than proven fact. Growing cannabis is its own science. Outdoor grows harness the power of natural sunlight and are cheaper, but they leave plants vulnerable to weather swings, pests, and contaminations. Greenhouses balance that by giving partial cover over the environment while still relying on the sun. Indoor cultivation, though, is the industry standard in many legal markets. It's expensive and energy intensive, but it allows for total control over light cycles, humidity, airflow, and nutrients, which in turn means more consistency, higher potency, and visually perfect buds that consumers tend to prize. Once the plant is harvested, it isn't ready yet. The flowers need to be dried slowly and cured, stored in controlled conditions that let chlorophyll break down and moisture even out. Poorly cured weed can taste harsh or grassy, while well-cured cannabis is smoother and more aromatic, and it retains its potency longer. Even storage after purchase matters. Light, heat, and oxygen degrade THC into CBN, dulling both the high and the flavor profile. All of this chemistry and cultivation feeds into the massive variety of cannabis products on the market. Flower is the traditional form, dried buds that you smoke or vape, but modern processing has branched out far beyond that. Concentrates range from sticky oils to glass-like shatter to buttery wax, each one representing a different extraction method that isolates cannabinoids and terpenes. Vaporizers use either distillate, a stripped-down, highly refined line THC oil, or full-spectrum extracts like live resin or live rosin that aim to preserve more of the original plant character. Edibles infuse cannabinoids into food, from brownies and gummies to sodas and capsules. Tinctures deliver cannabinoid in an alcohol or oil base, again absorbed under the tongue. What's striking is how one plant can transform into so many faces. A frosty flower, a golden dab, a neon gummy, a discreet vape card. They're all expressions of the same trichome chemistry, just processed in different ways. That's part of cannabis's modern identity. It's not one product, it's an entire spectrum of forms. It's really interesting. I should have said this earlier, but I hope that it's very well known that I do not endorse doing this drug unless it's legal where you are for you specifically. For example, if you're of the correct age and in a location where it's legal to do this, because obviously you should not break the law, and proceed with caution if you're doing this at all, please. Now, when it comes to cannabis, one of the hardest things to pin down is the line between medicine and recreation. People have been using it to treat ailments for centuries, but only in the last few decades have scientists begun to untangle where the evidence is solid, where it's promising, and where it's mostly anecdote. The strongest therapeutic case for cannabis is in managing chronic pain. Large reviews have consistently found that cannabis or cannabinoid-based medicines can reduce certain kinds of pain, especially neuropathic pain that doesn't respond well to other treatments. Cancer patients going through chemotherapy often find it useful for nausea and vomiting, and in that setting, cannabis has an established medical role. Appetite stimulation is another area, particularly in conditions like HIV/AIDS or wasting syndromes, where THC has been prescribed for years. Multiple sclerosis patients sometimes use cannabis to reduce spasticity and muscle tightness, and clinical trials have backed up at least modest improvements. And in the past decades, perhaps the most dramatic case has been epilepsy. Very specific treatment-resistant seizure disorders, especially in children, have responded to CBD-based medications, such as Epidiolex, which actually became the first cannabis-derived drug approved by the FDA. Beyond those uses, the research gets murkier, though. Some people swear by cannabis for sleep, anxiety, PTSD, or even as a creative aid, but the data in those areas is still mixed, consistent, or too early to draw firm conclusions. Of course, not every effect of cannabis is beneficial, and the acute side effects are well documented. The classic ones are harmless: dry mouth, red eyes, an increase in heart rate, and short-term memory lapses. But cannabis can also provide, stronger reactions. For some, THC induces anxiety rather than calming it. A racing pulse and intrusive thoughts can spiral into a full-blown panic attack, especially at higher doses or in stressful settings. There's also the infamous greening out, feeling dizzy, nauseous, sweaty, and disoriented after too much, which can send people to the floor or even to the ER, even though it's not life-threatening in the way like an opioid overdose is. The science of too much is more about threshold than toxicity. There's no documented lethal dose of THC in humans, but overconsumption can create hours of overwhelming discomfort, confusion, and paranoia that feel unbearable in the moment. The longer-term picture adds another layer of complexity. Cannabis can create dependence, and while it's less addictive than substances like nicotine or alcohol, withdrawal is real. People who stop heavy use can experience irritability, insomnia, appetite changes, and vivid dreams. The adolescent brain seems especially vulnerable. Heavy use during teenage years has been linked with poorer cognitive outcomes later in life. So seriously guys, please heed my advice. Though researchers debate whether cannabis causes those effects directly or if underlying social and genetic factors are also at play. Psychosis is another risk point, particularly for people already predisposed. Regular high-potency cannabis use has been associated with increased chances of psychotic episodes, especially in individuals with a family history of schizophrenia. Then there's cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS, a condition where long-term heavy users develop cycles of uncontrollable vomiting and abdominal pain, relieved only by hot showers. It's rare but serious, and the only treatment is stopping cannabis altogether. At the public health level, the conversation widens even further. Driving while high is a major concern. THC impairs reaction time, attention, and coordination, but unlike alcohol, there's no clear blood level that neatly defines impairment, which makes both testing and legal enforcement complicated. And also how normalized it is. Like, I was watching Dexter last night and like 2 cops were driving while high. In workplaces, cannabis raises safety issues in fields that rely on alertness and quick judgment, though the rules vary widely depending on whether you're in a state with legalization or prohibition. And then there are the broader mental health questions. Cannabis use has been linked to both relief from anxiety and the worsening of it, depending on the person and the context. Some studies suggest heavy use correlates with higher rates of depression, though it's often unclear which came first, the mood disorder or the cannabis. It's kind of like you don't know if it's correlation or just connection. So the story of cannabis isn't simple. It can ease suffering for patients with pain, nausea, or seizures, yet it can also create dependence, panic, or even psychosis in others. It can offer relief to some while complicating public safety for all. In short, it's a drug with 2 faces, therapeutic and risky, and where you land depends heavily on who you are, how you use it, and what your body and brain bring to the table. Now, the story of how weed became illegal in the United States in the first place isn't really about the plant itself. It's about fear, politics, and power. And I'm gonna get into this, but I just want to preface that I'm saying this is purely educational. My opinion I'm not gonna put in here, and I'm just stating facts. If I'm not trying to say that the US government is bad or what they're doing is wrong, I'm not supporting any kind of protest against them in this video. So let's move forward. In the early 20th century, cannabis had been used in medicines and tinctures for decades, but public perception shifted rapidly. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 brought a wave of immigration to the American Southwest, and with it came recreational cannabis smoking, called marijuana. Newspapers began stoking panic, framing the drug as something foreign and dangerous. I guess we've always been a little bit racist in this country. Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, became the loudest voice in this crusade. He tied cannabis to violent crime, insanity, and moral decay, often using overtly racist rhetoric to associate the drug with Mexican and Black communities. Films like Reefer Madness in the 1930s exaggerated these claims into absurd propaganda, but they left a lasting mark on public opinion. By 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing the plant at a federal level. The crackdown only deepened with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which slotted cannabis into Schedule 1, the strictest category alongside heroin, defined as having no acceptable medical use and a high potential for abuse. That classification became the backbone of the war on drugs under Nixon and Reagan, an era of zero tolerance and mandatory minimums that sent arrests and incarcerations skyrocketing. What's crucial to understand is that enforcement wasn't even. While rates of cannabis have always been relatively similar across racial groups, Black and Latino communities were, and still are, disproportionately targeted by arrests, searches, and prison sentences. Plant became less about chemistry and more about who held power and who didn't. Today, the legal landscape is fractured and constantly evolving. Some states maintain strict prohibition where even small amounts carry criminal penalties. Others have adopted decriminalization, removing jail time but still issuing fines. Medical legalization has spread widely, with patients able to access cannabis for qualifying conditions under doctor supervision. And in an increasing number of states, full adult use legalization has made cannabis commercially available, regulated like alcohol. Internationally, models vary from Canada's nationwide legalization to countries that still punish possession with prison time. Legally, there's also a key distinction between marijuana and hemp. Both came from the same species, Cannabis sativa, but US law defines hemp as cannabis containing less than 0.3% THC by dry weight. That line of the sand created an entire new industry, which is hemp-derived cannabinoids. Because hemp is legal under the 2018 Farm Bill, manufacturers began extracting compounds like CBD and converting hemp into psychoactive derivatives like Delta-8 THC and THCA flower, which skirt the letter of federal law law even while mimicking traditional marijuana products. It's a loophole that regulators are scrambling to close, and it highlights how messy cannabis law has become. Biology, chemistry, and policy colliding in ways the original lawmakers never anticipated. With legalization spreading, a new conversation has opened up around social equity. Millions of people, often from marginalized communities, were arrested for cannabis offenses in the past half-century, and many still carry criminal records that limit their opportunities long after serving their time. Expungement programs are one attempt to fix this, wiping away past convictions so that people can fully re-enter society. But the results have been uneven, with some states automating the process and others requiring individuals to navigate complicated legal systems on their own. Meanwhile, the legal cannabis industry is booming, worth tens of billions of dollars. But the people profiting are often not the same ones who bore the brunt of prohibition. Licenses and startup capital tend to go to large corporations or well-funded entrepreneurs, while smaller legacy growers and individuals from communities most affected by the war on drugs often struggle to even get a foot in the door. So cannabis policy is a paradox. On paper, the same plant is a Schedule I drug and also a tax-generating commodity. For some, it's still a ticket to prison, and for others, it's a multi-million-dollar business opportunity. And until those contradictions are resolved, until legalization addresses not just economics but justice, the shadow of prohibition lingers, no matter how many states flip the laws. As I already mentioned back in the section on cultivation, indoor versus outdoor growing shapes the plant's quality and cost. But in the context of the industry, those differences take on a financial weight. Indoor cultivation is expensive, massive energy bills from lighting, HVAC systems to control humidity, endless monitoring equipment. That's why part of dispensary flower often carries a premium price tag. Outdoor cultivation is cheaper and less resource intensive, but it can't always deliver the dense, cosmetically perfect buds that consumers expect. This split has created two parallel markets, one driven by boutique, high THC indoor strains that sell for top dollar, and another driven by bulk outdoor harvests that get funneled into extracts, edibles, or budget flower. It's not just agriculture, it's economics, and the costs of how the plant is grown ripple all the way down to what a consumer pays at the counter. Another hidden cost of the industry is testing. In legal markets, every batch of cannabis must be lab tested for potency and contaminants before it hits shelves, which, is a good thing, right? In theory, that's consumer protection, guaranteeing products are free from mold, pesticides, or heavy metals, which is still true, but in practice, it's created a phenomenon called THC inflation. Retail buyers often chase the higher percentage numbers, even though THC percentage doesn't straightforwardly predict how strong or enjoyable a product will feel. Growers and labs know this, and with competition fierce, there's constant pressure to report inflated potency numbers. Sometimes it's subtle, like they sample only the frostiest buds for testing. Other times it edges into outright fraud, with labs quietly massaging results to keep clients happy. The outcome is a marketplace where 2 jars of cannabis labeled 28% THC might not actually be equal, and consumers are left chasing a number rather than a full chemical profile. The gap between chemistry and branding becomes even clearer with strain names. Blue Dream, Girl Scout Cookies, Sour Diesel. These names sound like a guarantee, but in reality, they're closer to marketing labels than scientific categories. The same strain name grown by 2 different producers can vary wildly in chemical makeup, while 2 entirely different names might test almost identical. For consumers, that makes brand loyalty and marketing more important than taxonomy. Dispensaries lean into this, packaging cannabis with sleek logos, flavor-inspired names, and lifestyle imagery, turning a humble plant into a product line. Behind the glossy labels, the real determinant of effect is the chemover, the specific balance of cannabinoids and terpenes, not the catchy name printed on the jar. Now, culturally, cannabis has gone through a transformation just as dramatic as its market. Early media portrayals like Reefer Madness painted cannabis as a path to violence and insanity, a propaganda campaign that shaped generation. By the 1970s and 80s, cannabis became the emblem of counterculture, tied tied to hippies, rock musicians, and later rappers who celebrated it as part of their identity. In fact, right now as I'm recording this, I'm listening to La Romana by Bad Bunny, which the first line is Pásame la hookah, which means pass me the hookah. In the 2000s and 2010s, stoner comedies from figures like Seth Rogen reframed weed as goofy, harmless, and relatable, softening its image for mainstream audiences. Today, the plant has taken on yet another role, a wellness product. Yoga studios advertise CBD-infused classes, microdosing is marketed as a productivity hack, and cannabis beverages are pitched as the healthier social alternative to alcohol. The shift from criminalized drug to self-care accessory is one of the most striking cultural rebrands of modern times. Even traditions like 420 have moved from underground to mainstream. What started as an inside joke among high school friends in the 1970s, meeting at 4:20 p.m. to smoke, spread through Grateful Dead fans, cannabis culture, and eventually became the international weed holiday it is today. Dispensaries now run 420 sales, brands launch new products around that date, and festivals celebrate what once was a countercultural ritual. The fact that something once whispered about is now openly commercialized shows how far cannabis has traveled in the cultural imagination. But with normalization comes new ethical questions. Cannabis isn't just a modern commodity. It has a long history of use among indigenous peoples in parts of the world, from ritualistic contexts in India and Africa to its use in traditional medicine. The rapid commercialization of cannabis often sidelines those histories, packaging the plant as if it were invented in the past decade while ignoring cultural roots. Environmental impact is another pressing issue. Large-scale indoor cultivation consumes staggering amounts of electricity and water, leaving a heavy carbon footprint. Outdoor grows constrain local water supplies and impact ecosystems if not managed responsibly. As legalization scales up, the challenge is how to balance booming demand with sustainability, rather than repeating the extractive mistakes of other agricultural industries. So the cannabis industry today is a tangle of contradictions. And while 420 festivals and CBD lattes suggest cannabis has arrived in the mainstream, the deeper questions of equity, history, and sustainability tell us that the story is far from simple. One of the most prominent myths in cannabis culture is that sativa makes you energized and indica makes you sleepy. It's been repeated so many times that dispensaries still organize their shelves around those labels, but the truth is, it doesn't hold up scientifically. The plant's appearance and growth pattern that we already talked about, like that it's like tall and lanky for sativa and short and bushy for indica, they don't actually predict the effects once it's consumed. But we already kind of talked about that one a little bit earlier, so I'm gonna pretty much skip past it. Another misconception is that the idea that you can overdose on weed in the same sense you can overdose on opioids or alcohol. Cannabis does have uncomfortable overdose-like experiences: panic, paranoia, vomiting, even hallucinations in extreme cases. But there's no documented lethal dose of THC in humans, which I think I mentioned that earlier, I'm sorry for repeating myself. But animal studies suggest you need to consume astronomical amounts to reach toxicity, which is scary that I learned that, but how did they find that out, bro? So while you can definitely take too much and have a miserable time, it's not the kind of drug where one reckless night typically leads to the hospital. The risks are real, but they fall into categories of impairment, psychological distress, or long-term health effects rather than acute fatality. Then there's CBD, and because it comes from the same plant, many assume that CBD will make you high too, but it doesn't. Unlike THC, again, CBD does not bind strongly to CB1 receptors in the brain. People may feel calmer or less anxious when they take CBD, but that's not the same thing as being high. Its effects are subtle and for many barely noticeable unless it's taken at higher doses. That hasn't stopped marketing from blurring the lines, pitching CBD as if it were a softer, friendlier version of THC. In reality, it operates on a completely different set of mechanisms. A classic stoner myth is that holding in your hit makes you higher. The thinking is if you keep the smoke in your lungs longer, your body absorbs more THC. In practice though, nearly all of the THC is absorbed within the first couple seconds of inhalation. Holding your breath after that just deprives your brain of oxygen and increases exposure to tar and other combustion byproducts. And it's kind of fun, I mean it's not funny, but like, because I don't think it's dangerous, but the dizziness that people associate with a deeper hit isn't extra or THC, it's mild oxygen deprivation. The comparison between weed and alcohol is another myth that gets thrown around, usually as a blunt claim that cannabis is safer. The reality is more complicated. Cannabis doesn't carry the same overdose risk as alcohol, and it doesn't cause liver damage in the same way that long-term drinking does, but alcohol doesn't carry the same psychosis risk that heavy cannabis use does, and it doesn't affect adolescent brain development in quite the same ways. One isn't categorically safer than the other, they're just different, and they simply come with different sets of risks. It's natural, so it must be safe is another argument that doesn't stand up. Plenty of natural substances, tobacco, hemlock, arsenic, are dangerous or outright deadly. Cannabis grows naturally, but that doesn't erase its potential harms. It can impair driving, create dependence, trigger anxiety, or worsen mental health issues for certain people. Natural isn't a guarantee of harmlessness, it just describes the source. And finally, the belief that vapes are always safer than smoking flowers. At first glance, it makes sense. No combustion, no smoke, fewer carcinogens, but the reality is more nuanced. Vaporizing cannabis flower at controlled temperatures can reduce harmful byproducts, but commercial vape cartridges introduce other variables. Some are cut with thinning agents, contaminated with heavy metals from cheap hardware, or altered with synthetic cannabinoids. The 2019 outbreak of vaping-related lung injuries highlighted just how unsafe poorly made cartridges can be. So while vaping can be safer in specific contexts, it's not an automatic guarantee. The safety depends on what's inside the cartridge and how it's made, not just the fact that it's vapor instead of smoke. All of these myths reveal the same thing. Cannabis is a plant wrapped in decades of lore, marketing, and assumptions. Some of the stories we tell about it hold grains of truth, but most just collapse under scientific scrutiny. And as cannabis continues to move from the margins to the mainstream, separating fact from myth is more important than ever. The future of cannabis is being written right now, and it's less about joints and bongs than it is about labs and legislation. Scientists are expanding research into minor cannabinoids, compounds like CBG, CBN, and THCV that may hold unique therapeutic properties we've barely begun to map. Novel delivery methods are emerging too, from nano-emulsions that make cannabinoids water-soluble for faster absorption in beverages, to transdermal patches designed for steady, controlled dosing. Policy debates are heating up, with federal rescheduling in the US on the table and international models shifting toward broader legalization. At the same time, sustainability is becoming a pressing concern. Energy-hungry indoor grows are pushing innovators toward greener cultivation methods, from solar-powered facilities to regenerative outdoor farming. In short, the cannabis of tomorrow will look less like a counterculture symbol and more like a hybrid of science, policy, and sustainability, shaping one of the world's fastest evolving industries. And that's about all I have to say about weed, guys. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, follow my Instagram, join my Discord, and subscribe. But thank you so much for watching. Good night, everyone, and sweet dreams.